Welcome to NYSE Governance Services Inside Compliance. My name is Eric Moorhead. I'm Vice President and Senior Compliance Counsel with NYSE Governance Services. And today my guest is Doug Veivia, Special Agent with the FBI.
Hello, Eric. How are you?
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
One of the things that we have talked about before actually is the department, the SEC, and now even several foreign regulators and many other regulators really look to written standards, code of conduct, and other efforts to communicate that companies make with their employees whenever they're examining the effectiveness of an ethics and compliance program. You've spent your career examining companies where things may or may not have gone according to plan. How important, when you're first looking into a compliance program that a company has in place, is the written standards, the code of conduct?
Well, that's a very good point, and it truly is the foundation from which all else is built. Mm-hmm. The code of conduct is truly designed to enumerate what the company's philosophy for doing business is going to be. And as such, it should really be a completely clear and concise statement that says this is how we will conduct ourselves. The problem with some codes of conduct is that they try to be all-encompassing, all things to everybody, and they sometimes get lost in detail, when in fact what they really need to say is this is how we will conduct ourselves from a kind of like a moral and ethical point of view. If it's clear, concise, and readily understood, then it makes it easy to go off of. Of course, other challenges that have to be there. It has to be accessible to all parts of the company and all employees and vendors. And that sometimes is a challenge if you are a company that's doing business geographically dispersed in a number of different languages. So one of the things that we'll look to is, did the code of conduct adequately address the principles for which the company is trying to espouse? And was it accessible to all employees in all languages? And then lastly, one of the things that we would like to see is that the code of conduct is evaluated periodically just to make sure that it still remains relevant, because business conditions and business marketing changes as time goes on, and we want to make sure that the code of conduct addresses those changes.
Mm-hmm. You used, in your answer, you used the famous F word, the foundation, that the department and SEC have used in the guidance for FCPA that came out a couple years ago, but also that term has been used quite a bit by the department over the last few years in explaining the importance of a code. But you also mentioned in your answer the importance of having it accessible. Communicating these standards, whether they're in the code or other written standards, is obviously equally important as having those standards, because if no one knows about it, it doesn't really have a lot of value. What are a couple of sort of rookie mistakes you've seen in organizations you've looked into? Maybe they had a decent code of conduct but didn't communicate it. What, besides having accessible in different language, what are some other errors that you've seen?
Sure. One of the things that you'll see oftentimes if it's a mistake, or truly not somewhat of an immature program, is it'll be posted on a central corporate website and then that's it. Well, the person that's doing business in Manila out of a foreign office there, or their vendors, may or not be readily accessing that website. So it's important that the code of conduct be a living policy, a living and breathing item in which it's not just put out there once a year on a central website that someone can look at, but is more readily embodied in the day-to-day business practices. So if there was one mistake that we'd say that we see often, it's that failure to connect that part to the day-to-day activities. And we want to know that, not just the commitment from senior leadership, but also that when there are business unit leaders having a meeting about a proposed contract or a new business venture, that they're also actively discussing how the code of conduct is implicated in terms of what business decisions they will make. And when we have that level of engagement between the compliance professionals and the business units, you find that you have a much more effective program. And I really like that for a lot of reasons, simply because when you have engagement with the business unit leaders, the compliance personnel now have a better understanding of how the business is actually conducted at the street level, and as a result they should have a much better understanding of what some of the business risks are. It's sometimes hard to sit in New York City and come up with the risks are for compliance if I'm talking about business in Indonesia. So doing that not only helps understand those risks better, but also engages the business unit in a way that will help achieve buy-in and hopefully make the process a more living and breathing process that's integrated into day-to-day activity. It's that disconnect that, quite frankly, becomes a challenge. And then other times, we'll find instances where there'll be a code of conduct that's published, but again, as simple as it sounds, not made available in languages that are relevant to the local workforce. And if I'm hiring a local sales manager in Indonesia as an example, if they don't read and can understand the code of conduct that I have posted on my corporate headquarters here in the United States, that does us little good in terms of managing the risks associated with that. Yeah. So that's a big part of it.
Okay. It does seem like it's rather simple to translate the code, but I've seen that, as obviously you have many times, that simple mistake like that can really be critical.
Right. You know, and if I may, there are other times when there are failures of opportunity, right? Missed opportunities to try and live the process a little bit. And one of the ones that I quite frankly like the most is making it a part of everyone's performance plan. So if I'm doing an annual renewal of my performance metrics, I should have a code of conduct reflected in that annual performance metrics. And then when I'm doing my year-end performance appraisal, I'm now measuring against behavior and conduct against that written compliance standard. And I think that's another way to provide some meaningful connection between the individual employees in different places and the policies at which we're trying to live by.
Mm-hmm. A few years back when I was in private practice, I used to have a cheat sheet that we had prepared for our clients, what they should do if a regulator sends a subpoena or comes knocking at the door, if an agent comes to talk to them about their business. I know you can't give away any trade secrets here, but what are some self-inflicted wounds that you've seen during the beginning stages of investigations that probably could have been avoided by organizations under investigation? Right.
Yeah, well, you're right. I have to keep all the secrets to myself. But there are some that's an answer that actually has kind of two components. One would be if we're talking about what the corporate response would be, and one which for the individual response. On the corporate level, the department certainly makes it sound like it's an obvious decision to self-report. From the other side of the table, though, it's not always so obvious, and it's not always so obvious as to when to do that. But one of the mistakes that we will find is that there will be ultimately a decision to self-report that's delayed. And if you look at the sentencing guidelines, one of the things that they measure specifically on is timely self-reporting. And timely self-reporting is critical for two reasons. What we don't want to have are instances where the company may conduct 175 or 200 interviews of individuals prior to self-reporting. That can have an impression that perhaps things are not exactly everything they seem to be. But understandably, a company is going to want to do their own due diligence to try and scope the problem and find out what the appropriate response should be. But having done that, you know, we would encourage companies to make a timely self-disclosure, and there's some room for variance in that. The other part, that once disclosure is made, there are times that there are varying degrees of cooperation from the company. And from our perspective, it's almost perhaps too simplistic in that we're saying we're all in or not. And I think there are times when we find that companies are sometimes a little bit slow in their responses to requests for data, slow in producing witnesses that we would ask for, and certainly that's their right, but the risk associated with that is that they might get less credit when it comes time to a measure against what the sentencing guidelines may say. The other risk that the company assumes in taking a delayed response to self-reporting is that there's a risk that the conduct could be reported through other channels. And with that then becomes perhaps the potential for a whistleblower that may come forward, and that truly boxes the company in terms of getting credit for self-reporting at that point. So those are all reasonable things that a company has to balance, but those are real risks that are out there. If I may, on the other hand, if an agent knocks at your door as an individual company employee, they're not there by chance. And the big thing to remember there is that there's a belief that someone wanted to speak to you because they believe you have information that will further the understanding that the agents have of the conduct. It's always everybody's right to say, no, thank you, I don't want to speak to you. But if you do decide to speak to the agents, the one thing we would always stress is that you should be truthful and accurate in your responses. You can always decline to speak or answer a specific question, but unfortunately we've seen instances where people think that they can influence the investigation by providing somewhat less than a truthful answer, and that's never a good idea.
That's never a good idea, because sometimes the obstruction count in the indictment carries more potential pen time than the fraud itself. That's very good advice. You mentioned cooperation. Again, I know you can't give away too much of the secret sauce. as to the discussions that you and the prosecutors have when you're making a determination about whether to move forward and charge an organization or resolve a case that involves an organization. And you mentioned cooperation and timeliness. How big of a factor is the compliance effort, the compliance program, in the decision making about whether to move forward? As much as you can tell us about that
Sure.
process.
Well, there's really no secret in this case. You know, along with timely self-reporting and cooperation, there's no bigger factor than the effectiveness of a compliance program. The good news is that no one expects compliance programs to be perfect. No one expects that the best compliance program can necessarily prevent 100% all improper conduct. But a good compliance program is designed to do three things, and that's one, prevent the conduct, identify the conduct, and then remediate the conduct. If a compliance program truly is effective in accomplishing those three things, then you've gone a long ways as to overcoming whatever kind of skepticism there may be about how this occurred to begin with. But you know, organizations are like a community, and every community has its spectrum of behavioral conduct. You know, from the best conduct to sometimes less than ideal conduct. So if a violation occurs and it's treated in an otherwise meaningful and responsible way to remediate that conduct and then make changes to prevent that conduct from occurring again, then that's a very effective program. And if you have a one-off type of violation in an otherwise very effective program, there's a strong likelihood that that's going to be very favorably viewed by the department.
I think that's helpful advice for those out there that are wondering what might happen if there's a knock at the door. Doug, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Inside Compliance, and join us next time.